Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Virtual Enlightenment Salon of January 16th, 2022. Today we are pleased to bring to you a fascinating exploration of transfigurism and how Mormonism and transhumanism relate to one another. And first, let me introduce to you our distinguished panel. We have here our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia. We have our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer. We have our Northern California Liaison, Celeste Castaldo. And we have our Technology Advisor and Foreign Ambassador in Spain, Dr. Jose Cordero. And our special guest today is the CEO of the Mormon Transhumanist Association, Carl Youngblood. Carl co-founded the Mormon Transhumanist Association in 2006 and has served as various capacities throughout its history, including as secretary, vice president, director, and conference organizer. He has over 20 years of professional experience as a software engineer and currently works as a blockchain consultant. He has a bachelor's degree in Portuguese from Brigham Young University and a master's degree in computer science from the University of Washington. So definitely a distinguished individual and a great guest to have to introduce a lot of our viewers to the Mormon Transhumanist Association, the idea of transfigurism, and the great work that the MTA has been doing over the past 14 years. So welcome, Carl. You have the floor.
Thank you, Gennady. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I thought that I would begin by sharing some prepared remarks for about 10 or 15 minutes about the association, and then I'd love to open the floor for questions and discussion as we move forward. And I have some slides ready, and I'll go ahead and share those now. Just a moment. All right, just wanted to double check that you can still hear me. Everything good?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, thank you. So, although most religious people anticipate some kind of eventual salvation and victory over death, it's not uncommon for many of them to hesitate when the prospect is actually within reach. When grand overarching redemption narratives remain in the distant future, they're safe. They provide comfort in trials without interfering too much with our daily lives. The surprising near-term apocalyptic predictions of transhumanists, however, can be disturbing. They threaten the tidily sewn-up redemption narratives, perhaps especially for some Mormons whose non-metaphysical universe is compatible enough with the transhumanist visions of the future to give them pause. Many people react to these visions with both awe and disappointment, sometimes at the same time. There's a feeling of, whoa, that's crazy, and wait, is that all there is? Sort of like the red-headed man who is at first astounded at Sherlock Holmes' ability to divine intimate details of his personal history, but who, after having it all explained to him, says, I thought at first you'd done something clever, but I see that there was nothing in it after all. That's from the Red-Headed League, Arthur Conan Doyle. At our 2014 MTA conference, our Mormon guest speaker, Adam Miller, shared his reservations about transhumanism with a vivid metaphor. Outing himself as perhaps the most reluctant resurrectionist in all Mormondom, Miller used the pop culture vampire as a metaphor for radical life extension. For the vampire, said he, the extension of life itself inevitably becomes something to be suffered. Every cable TV vampire worth their salt finds their existential crisis heightened rather than ameliorated by their quasi-immortality. Unquote. Miller made the important point that physical renewal without a corresponding spiritual transformation, which is what presumably Miller assumes transhumanist salvation to be, would only serve to increase our boredom and brokenness. Like many religious people, Miller seems reluctant to accept transhumanist salvation as legitimate, for perhaps good reasons, depending on which transhumanists one is listening to. I'd like to address these kinds of concerns today. They arise, I believe, both from lack of imagination on the part of many religionists and from lack of ethical awareness on the part of many transhumanists. This is also an area where I believe that the Mormon Transhumanist Association can provide some thought leadership. It can sometimes be alienating to be a religious transhumanist. The Apostle Paul seemed to describe our predicament well when he said that his message was unto the Jews a stumbling block and unto the Greeks foolishness. On the one hand, many futurists, technologists, and transhumanists are strongly secular and see little or no benefit in the religious perspectives that we articulate. On the other hand, the ways we frame these perspectives is often viewed with suspicion by other religious people. One of our primary goals as an organization is to try to bridge the gap between the sublime and the secular. We want to get strangers talking to each other and finding more common ground with one another. Come to a meetup of Mormon transhumanists and you'll find some strange combinations. Devoutly religious people rub shoulders with skeptics and atheists, and everyone seems to still be friends. Conversations tend to be enthusiastic and respectful. Who are these people? You may notice this reference here in my slide to a famous term coined by Stephen Jay Gould, where he called religion and science non-overlapping magisteria. But in the Mormon Transhumanist Association, at any rate, we don't see religion and science as completely separate domains. Why do we care about bridging this gap? We feel that both sides of this divide need each other in important ways. Ours is an age in which much technological progress seems to be carried out by secularists. According to a recent survey published in Sociology of Religion, the rate of atheism and agnosticism in the academy is roughly 10 times higher than in the general population of the United States. There's a perception that many secularists have a disdain for religious people and a lack of respect for tradition. This perception, warranted or not, makes it a lot harder for society to successfully navigate many of the existential risks in our future. Scientists and technologists are distrusted at times when their opinions are increasingly important, and this distrust can often lead to reduced funding for scientific research. Mormon transhumanism attempts to syncretize and valorize traditional practices while holding our minds open to new possibilities. Having been raised for the most part in traditional backgrounds, we see the value in these traditions while we also recognize some of their limitations. We want to respect and preserve tradition to the extent it remains beneficial, but we've also personally observed that many secular groups connected with transhumanism have struggled with internal contention and disagreement that has hampered their progress. Our Mormon upbringing has given us an exceptional capacity for cooperation that helps us to overcome these fractious tendencies and get things done. The Mormon Transhumanist Association, partly as a result of these qualities, is currently the largest advocacy network for the ethical use of technology and religion, and one of the largest transhumanist organizations. So Mormonism bolsters these two qualities among transhumanists, among others. It promotes a more respectful and less disdainful attitude towards those people and groups whose cooperation will be critical towards the future success of our civilization. And it understands how to organize effectively. In addition to these pragmatic qualities, Mormon theology is remarkably compatible with a secular worldview in ways that are often surprising to those who are less familiar with it. Mormon scripture teaches that, quote, there is no such thing as immaterial matter, unquote, but that all spiritual phenomena must ultimately be measurable and observable in some way. Properly speaking, there is no metaphysics in Mormon cosmology. All phenomena, even those that appear to us to be miraculous, must have some natural explanation, and even God is bound by law. Mormons also view God as a progressing being or community of beings who previously lived in a state very similar to the one we're experiencing now. These and other beliefs have the potential to make Mormonism much more coherent and palatable to secular audiences, although I believe our culture hasn't historically attempted to reach these audiences as well as we could. On more than one occasion, I've seen diehard atheists become quite surprised and taken aback by some of these ideas. Many secular transhumanist visions of the future fail to address important ethical challenges that religion has explored more seriously. For example, Ray Kurzweil, in his best-selling book, The Singularity is Near, describes a hedonistic future in which people will be able to have sex in virtual worlds with simulations of their favorite celebrities. Christian pastor and transhumanist Chris Bennick rescues this narrative by pointing out that any intimate relationship worth having requires both parties to be sentient. And once a being is sentient, we are morally obligated to obtain its consent for all our interactions with it, and to interact with it in ways that are conducive to its well-being as well as ours. This brings up the concept of mind uploading. Some secular transhumanist visions of the future have spoken of the body as a burden and a nuisance that we will eventually discard when it becomes possible to upload our consciousness directly into a computer. Mormon theology, on the other hand, values embodiment highly and claims that only when our consciousness is united with the body can we receive a fullness of joy. Indeed, artificial intelligence researchers are discovering how essential embodiment is to many aspects of learning. While we may eventually gain the ability to upload our minds to another computational substrate, that substrate had better be as rich as what we are currently experiencing, or it will lack essential aspects of living. For all relevant intents and purposes, successfully uploaded minds will be embodied still. I've touched on some of the ways religious transhumanism can complement and inform secular audiences, and I'd like to spend some more time now addressing some concerns we often hear from religious audiences, both Mormon and non. As I said earlier, Adam Miller raised the concern that mere immortality would be insufficient to overcome our natural brokenness and propensity to sin, and could in fact exacerbate some of the problems of our present existence. I agree with him, and I feel that his calling attention to this deficiency is a good example of how secular transhumanism may sometimes overlook or downplay certain ethical challenges. Merely living indefinitely would not satisfy us if the nature of our lives did not also adapt to our new condition. Mormonism distinguishes between immortality, which we think of as overcoming death, and eternal life, which is defined as overcoming sin or achieving a state of godlike compassion and benevolence. Mormon transhumanists believe that such eternal life is both something we should strive toward as we contemplate any physical healing or enhancement, and something that we should use all tools at our disposal to try to achieve, including science and technology. Another concern that is often expressed by religious people is the worry that we are playing God. That is, that there are certain lines in the sand that are the purview of God alone, and that we are not to cross. I believe that this reflects a misunderstanding of our relationship with God. Jesus repeatedly described our relationship with Him and God as one of intimate communion and interconnectivity. He prayed that we might be one in Him, even as He is one with the Father, and described Himself as a vine on which His disciples were the branches. Paul taught further that we are members of the body of Christ, and that as we serve in our several capacities, we become the means through which the salvation of Christ is administered. In this sense, playing God is exactly what we are called to do as the servants of God. We are called to be God's eyes, ears, hands, and feet, and to be the means through which God's salvation is administered. Mormonism goes further to claim that our divine destiny, our most noble aspiration, is to become like our heavenly parents, gods. This, of course, doesn't mean that it isn't possible to pursue desired futures in detrimental ways, just that the appropriateness of certain technological advances depends greatly on the context and the motivations of those involved. Whether or not playing God is a virtue or a vice depends entirely on the type of God we are playing. Do we use our power to exalt ourselves to the exclusion of others, or to exalt our fellows alongside ourselves? Do we strive to emulate the noblest qualities we can conceive of in our heavenly parents, or do we selfishly lord our authority over others? Mormonism teaches that power and influence can only be maintained by persuasion, by long suffering, by gentleness and meekness, and by love unfeigned. This is the model that Mormon transhumanists strive to emulate. Futurists, technologists, and secularists stand to benefit from the contributions of this merry band of oddballs, as do the traditionally religious. In speaking of our work, we often use the Jim Bridger analogy. When the pioneers and settlers migrated westward, they didn't blaze their own trails. Instead, they followed the trails that others had blazed, like the trapper Jim Bridger. As we seek to identify and map this terrain, our hope is that this reconnaissance work may be of future benefit to our brothers and sisters both in and out of church. And one final note that I'd like to share with you all as I close my prepared remarks is that we are preparing a rather audacious conference this year on March 19th. And you can find more about this conference at mtaconf.org. And I regret that I had planned to prepare a discount code for viewers of the transmission today, but I forgot at the last minute. But I will go ahead and send that to Gennady so that he can share that with you all. But we really look forward to you there. This conference, we feel, has a breakout appeal to a wider audience than some of our typical conferences. And we're very excited to share it with a broader audience and would love to see you there. So with that, I will open up the floor for any questions or other comments that some would like to make, and I will stop sharing my presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Carl, for that fascinating presentation. To many of our viewers, it is an introduction to Mormon transhumanism, but to some of our viewers, it is more of a review of what they are aware of already. For instance, our friend TJ Wass is a recent Latter-day Saints convert. He was baptized during Halloween of 2020. He says he loves the mission of the Mormon Transhumanist Association. He teaches adult Sunday school for the Pryor, Oklahoma Church Ward. And he also writes that he tries to add in insights about longevity medicine to ensure that essentially the life-prolonging mission of our organizations is recognized. And he even talks about robot rights and artificial intelligence. The U.S. Transhumanist Party has delved into those subjects in our Transhumanist Bill of Rights. He has a question for you, Carl. How well has the MTA been received in other church congregations? We know that among Mormons, as well as those who espouse other religious perspectives, there's a spectrum of views in terms of receptiveness toward transhumanism.
Yes, I would say, TJ, I admire your audacity and just kind of sharing these ideas in Sunday school, and would love to be a fly on the wall in your particular Sunday school class to see how it goes over. I would say that my general approach to this has been to play the long game and to share thoughts as the opportunity arises in the various contexts that I find myself in at church. So that means that when we're in an open discussion, I will often share the importance of embracing all that has been revealed and discovered by science, and of making use of all the means at our disposal before we appeal to God for help, right? So I try to get these messages in regularly, but I don't campaign so overtly for the Mormon Transhumanist Association in a church setting. But several of my local church members do know of my affiliation and have complimented me about it and expressed appreciation for my service in that regard.
Yes, thank you for that response, Carl. And I can certainly understand that in different venues, one would emphasize that Mormon transhumanist aspect to a greater or lesser extent. I was fascinated in your presentation by the discussion of how Mormons essentially believe that every phenomenon ultimately does have a natural, measurable, objectively identifiable explanation, even the nature of God. And that is actually a contrast to what I've heard from a lot of other religious denominations who have made statements like, well, God is outside of space and time and causality, and none of our understandings of reason or natural law apply to God. And for me, as an atheist, rationalist, secularist, that kind of explanation, it's essentially a non-answer. It's essentially a statement that, well, everything you think about the world doesn't apply to God. And my follow-up would be, well, how can I then relate to your worldview? Let's try to find some common areas, some common aspects that we can start building off from. And I think to some extent with the more naturalistic vision that you've articulated, it is easier to do that with Mormon thought than with some other denominations' theologies. And I'm curious if you think this is an outgrowth of the time and place where Mormonism originated. Mormonism originated in the early 19th century in the United States. This is the aftermath of the Age of Enlightenment, and a country that was founded expressly on the principles of the Age of Enlightenment. A lot of the American founders were influenced by the Enlightenment philosophers and their views of a natural world that is fathomable, that is systematic, that is orderly, where science is not sin or heresy, but for many of them, it was either the attempt to understand God's creation, or they were deists and they viewed essentially a deity, if it existed, as having initiated the dynamics of the natural world and then left it to its own orderly functioning. So Mormonism arose in that sort of setting. Do you think Mormonism is an Enlightenment influenced, at the very least, set of ideas?
I definitely do think that. Backing up just a bit, some of your first comments I thought were quite insightful and interesting. One of the challenges, I think, with what I call an absolutist conception of deity and an absolutist theology that places God outside of time and space and places God as the creator of everything that is what we call theodicy, or the problem of evil. I think one of the challenges there is that if God was in charge of everything that is as it is right now, then why are things suboptimal in the present universe that we seem to inhabit? And why then would Jesus pray, that thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, if his will was already done? We could ask, right? So I think that in some ways, what's really fascinating about Mormon theology is that it places constraints on God. God is a being within time and space that got to where they are through the proper application of certain principles. Um, and one other, I guess, little wrinkle or complexity that I would add to this observation, though, is that it may be the case that God, as a being or community of beings, may still be operating in a different computational substrate than the one that we presently inhabit, which might still make it seem like certain things were happening in our sphere that might even appear to be miraculous, but might have a logical explanation when viewed from the outer substrate, so to speak. So I would say that it's still possible to kind of, depending on your views about the simulation hypothesis and other things like that, it's possible to imagine a God that occasionally does perform some type of thing that seems miraculous and yet be operating according to natural law, right? So that's just one additional little wrinkle that I would add. But then to get to your final question about the emergence of Mormonism in the 19th century on the American continent, I definitely agree that uh, Joseph Smith and other successors to Joseph Smith as the leaders of the church were very much in the vein of the Enlightenment, where even if they had folk beliefs that today we might feel to be a little bit naive or superstitious, they certainly were heavily influenced by the principles upon which their nation was founded, and they were very comfortable with speculating about scientific exploration and the hypotheses of the science of their day. So, for example, Joseph Smith had been reading tracts written by, I forget the name of the person right now, but a person who had spoken of the other planets in our solar system as being inhabited. And so this notion of beings, of other worlds in the cosmos and of beings that might inhabit those other worlds was fascinating to Joseph Smith and his contemporaries. And he even, being the, I think, creative and bold and perhaps brash person that he was, started, just jumping and riffing on this concept and saying that the moon was inhabited, and so was the sun, right? So, obviously he got some things wrong, but he was certainly very, very influenced by scientific explorations of his time, and loved to explore and speculate in a theological vein along those discoveries. And I think that this revelation of his about there is no such thing as immaterial matter comes from that Enlightenment perspective as well. So I definitely agree with you there.
Yes, thank you very much, Carl, for that thorough answer, and definitely one that lends itself open to exploration in multiple respects, which I hope to do further in this discussion. We have a question from Dr. Jose Cordero, especially since we had as our guests during the last Virtual Enlightenment Salon of 2021, Micah Redding and Jonathan Gunnell of the Christian Transhumanist Association, the CTA, and we had a fascinating conversation with them as well. I highly recommend that Virtual Enlightenment Salon. So Jose wonders, what are the main differences between the CTA and the MTA that our viewers should appreciate?
Yeah, so I did tune into that session as well and really enjoyed it. And Micah Redding, one of the founders of the CTA, has been closely associated with us even before the CTA was founded. He attended several of our conferences and has been an appreciated and welcome guest with us. One of the things I personally admire about Micah is that he comes from a tradition of preaching in his particular faith tradition, where he was taught from a very early age to rehearse and rehearse and rehearse before giving a sermon. so that when he preaches his message, whatever it happens to be, and he's preached to us, at our conferences, he does it always extemporaneously, but he never misses a beat. He is amazingly inspiring to listen to and are quite articulate, but he never ums and ahs and struggles. Whereas, our faith tradition is usually of folks like reading a teleprompter, and that's about as exciting as it gets. So I enjoy listening to Micah. But I would say several of our founders, I think Lincoln Cannon, myself, and a few others contributed to the founding of the CTA. And I feel that, not speaking on Micah's behalf, I think that part of what inspired him to found the CTA was that he saw a lot of interesting and important things we were discussing and addressing. And he felt like this could be brought to a wider audience that might perhaps not be as receptive to it if it was coming from Mormons. So I think that for him, he thought, well, there's a much larger group of Christians in general who would perhaps find some of this message interesting, who may not think of or consider, learning more from the MTA directly. So I think he just kind of felt that there were fruitful fields in other places that he could spread the word in, so to speak.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Carl, for that discussion and indeed for elaborating on some of the collaborations between the MTA and the CTA and how the environment of the MTA essentially motivated Micah to try to create a similar intellectual milieu for reaching out to other Christians who may also be receptive to the message of transhumanism. So this is quite interesting from a historical perspective as well. Now I would like to turn the floor over to Celeste Castaldo. She would like to say a few words about the compatibility of transhumanist goals and the Christian religion.
Hi, yeah. So my question was about the basically how the transhumanist goals are not opposing the Christian religion.
Yeah. So is it basically whether or not it's perceived as in opposition to Christianity? Because I know some Christians definitely see transhumanism as a threat. We certainly don't, but different Christians have different views. Can you clarify just a little bit, Celeste, there?
Well, yeah, I guess just based on your opinion and from your background, maybe from the Mormon Christian perspective, because it's enlightening to hear those people who are Christian believers and in following the Christian faith who are transhumanist supporters. So I would like to hear your opinion on that.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for the clarification. So, yeah, for me, I think that my particular perspective has been born out of a variety of life experiences. I would say, first of all, that I often characterize the last 20 years or so of my life as a kind of faith struggle, partly because I was raised in a fairly traditional Mormon home, but as I became more aware of science and technology and some of the other things that you just unavoidably are exposed to in the course of getting a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, I started to realize that some of the narratives that I inherited from some members of my church were a little bit simplistic, maybe naive, maybe a little superficial, in that they just kind of talked about some of these deeper hopes that many Christians and Mormons have around things like the resurrection, immortality, eternal life, other some of the sort of winding up, promises and blessings that are given to people of faith. I realized that those narratives might not, fully address some of the challenges in specific issues that we face today. And also that in some cases they conflict, right? That some of the narratives that I inherited growing up uh, were in direct conflict with some of the other things that were very obvious to me and self-evident as I learned and researched more. So for me, it was kind of a question of, do I discard my faith after facing kind of doubts and concerns about some of these issues, or do I strive to kind of identify things that are still of value while being willing to revise my views about some things, right? And also, am I willing to continue to engage with my fellow, you know, co-parishioners, even if occasionally my ideas might be a little disturbing or different from theirs, right? That's also a big aspect, I would say, of any faith community, is the actual community component of it. And while I appreciate the feeling of friendship and fellowship that I get from my local, faith community, there are times when, I might ruffle some feathers, or people might ruffle my feathers, or whatever, so those were some things I've had to go through and continue to go through. And so I think that part of my motivation in coming up with and rethinking some of the narratives in order to make them more compatible with some of my observations about the natural world and about the emergence and progression of technology was in an effort to kind of to still extract some value from, to see that the things that I really could still value and appreciate, but to also add on to what I had inherited and try to inform both perspectives with each other. And I see this pursuit personally as quintessentially Mormon, in the sense that Joseph Smith, near the end of his life, said one of the grand fundamental principles of Mormonism is to receive truth, let it come from whence it may. And that if we do not gather up all the true principles in the world, in every religion and in every discipline, regardless of where they may come from, that we aren't, by that standard, true Mormons, according to him. So I love to quote these kinds of, authoritative statements, because I feel that they have some cachet with my fellow religionists, and they help to perhaps persuade them that no, to be Mormon is not necessarily to retain a static set of beliefs, but actually to continue to revise one's worldview as one is exposed to new information. So that's kind of the approach I've taken. But I would also say that, generally speaking, many members of my church are quite positive about technology, generally speaking, and that we tend to be amongst the early adopters of many technologies. And we have a list of, hundreds of inventions that have actually been made by Mormons. So I'm not sure exactly what it is, but there's something peculiar about our particular faith that doesn't see technology as quite of a threat as some other faiths seem to do. So I'm not sure what the reason for that is.
Yes, this is quite interesting. Thank you, Carl. And I have observed Mormons are quite well represented in technologically oriented professions. So I am an actuary by profession, and I know many Mormon actuaries myself. I have worked with them, and I've always found them to be exceptionally knowledgeable, organized, determined, and civil. So generally quite a pleasure to work with Mormon actuaries. I find a lot of parallels in terms of this technological orientation and the intellectualism with the Jewish community. And I've had a lot of connections within the Jewish community as well, both the Russian Jewish community as well as in the United States. And also there is this ethos of a kind of orderly, productive self-improvement, love for knowledge, love for the search of truth, and an embrace of new technological possibilities. Now, that's two religious communities that exhibit this to a great extent. We know, however, not all religious communities are like this. Our friend Jennifer Hughes, who is a great ally and supporter of ours, she was endorsed as a candidate by the U.S. Transhumanist Party for mayor of Camden, New Jersey in 2021, does point out that unfortunately transhumanism is often frowned upon by certain religious persons, and it's wonderful to have a religious organization like the MTA and the CTA to counter that misconception. But her own experience growing up was that she grew up in an extremely religious setting, and she was very ostracized. She wanted to end sickness and death, and that seems to be aligned with a lot of theological aspirations of many religious denominations, yet she was constantly told she had grandiose ideas, she writes, as if that is a bad thing, and that she was playing God. And you pointed out playing God is not necessarily undesirable either in Mormon theology, and unfortunately she was even often physically beaten and punished for it. So I wonder, Carl, what distinguishes either within a particular religious group or across religious denominations, those who are very, let's say, open-minded, focused on self-improvement, growth, the pursuit of truth, are open to technology, are open to different ways of looking at the world. And on the other hand, those who are quite dogmatic, who are insistent that a very narrow interpretation of their theology is the only correct one. And unfortunately, in the case of Jennifer's early upbringing, some of those people might even resort to very coercive measures to try to keep people in line. Where do the differences lie? How do we essentially distinguish the traits that lead to one approach versus the other?
It's a really fascinating and difficult question to respond to. I think as I observe different tendencies amongst cultures and people, that some of these tendencies might even be more pervasive than merely part of a single religion or a set of religions. And in fact, what I observe, for example, what I observe in our own American history is I observe two veins very strongly in American history. One would be a puritanical vein, which I think of as the Plymouth community that was first founded. And one would be a more entrepreneurial vein, which I think of as the Jamestown community that was also first founded both on the East Coast of the US. But when you see those personalities, if you will, of these two cultures, they seem to almost continue along with us throughout our history. And even to this day, where you find Americans both on the right and the left of the political spectrum who wax almost puritanical about their beliefs, if you will, and almost feel like they need to kind of hammer them, beat them into us, if you will. And then, and forgive me, I mean, those don't sound like two very flattering observations about our culture, but I can't help but make them. And I think that in a similar way amongst religious folks, there is this tendency to see some ambitions, some human ambitions, as kind of prideful or as somehow not giving due respect for their betters, right? In the case of religion, clearly, the idea is that God is our better, right? God is something above and beyond us. And I think many religions feel that to aspire to godliness is almost an affront. And I personally think this is a misunderstanding of various theologies, including Christianity. I feel that Christianity really did initially preach the transformation of both the individual and the community in the image of God. But I think that often this is seen as going too far. And I think one example would be Calvinism, which is a kind of certain vein of Christianity that is very much focused on the utter inferiority, the utter depravity of the individual and their inability to do anything good of their own accord, right? And I also think this may emerge from perhaps a misunderstanding of what praise actually is. I like to use the example when I say, I think that a being that is truly a godlike being is not going to be very appreciative or is not going to admire very much if we just say, you are so awesome, you are so awesome, we're not worthy all the time. I actually think that if I were an enlightened being, that I would admire more than anything else that others of a lesser station than myself were striving to emulate me, were striving to follow my example, right? And so I say, along with Jane Austen and whoever was the original coiner of this phrase, that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? And so when I think of true praise, I would like to see more religious people praise through emulation rather than praise through some sort of false modesty and constant self-abasement, if that makes sense.
Yes, that absolutely makes sense to me. And indeed, it reminds me of a quotation from Thomas Jefferson, who wrote, "Question with boldness even the existence of a God, because if there be one, he must approve more of the homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear." And that is very much an Enlightenment era attitude toward what the nature of God might be. And it's interesting, too, because I have a bit of personal background by which I can relate to this. So when I was applying to colleges, I was invited to Hillsdale College, which I ultimately ended up attending for their Merit Scholars Weekend. And it was clear that I was going to get some sort of merit scholarship, but the question was, what amount would I receive? Would it be half tuition, 3/4 tuition, or full tuition? And there was a rigorous set of interviews. Ultimately, I was summoned before a panel of professors, and we discussed a variety of subjects: history, philosophy, economics. And I knew that Hillsdale had a kind of Christian religious ethos, even though it's a non-denominational school. And there I was, a lifelong atheist, transhumanist, and I was trying to be fairly careful and gentle in my answers, but I did essentially articulate an Enlightenment era vision of rationality, the scientific method, self-improvement, a kind of enlightened individualism. And it was aligned in many ways with what a lot of the people at Hillsdale College valued. But then the professor of theology over there asked me this question: well, you've articulated a very interesting vision. What room does it leave for God? And I was thinking, I don't want to offend anyone with overt atheism here, especially because they're going to be making a scholarship decision for me. So I'm going to offer a very conciliatory kind of response. And that is, well, if God has all of these excellent qualities, if he is truly such a great being, then shouldn't we try to emulate God? Shouldn't we try to become more like God and aspire toward that? Now, I wonder how the professors actually received that, whether they saw through that and said, well, this is a godless atheist speaking and this is heresy, or did they think to themselves, is he actually a Mormon? And now I wonder if that thought might have occurred to some of them. So the end result of that process was I ended up receiving a 3/4 tuition scholarship. So an intermediate outcome. It seems they didn't hate my answer, but perhaps they thought, well, this man is different. He's definitely not exactly of the Hillsdale culture, exactly the kind of person we would want to feature and highlight. So we'll acknowledge this, but yes, he's different, and we clearly see this. But I wonder if the majority of the professors were Mormon, would the outcome have been different? So that's a little personal story that I think plays into a lot of what you're saying. And Lincoln Cannon in the chat says, Gennady, are you a closet Mormon? Well, I think there are a lot of affinities between the transhumanist worldview and the Mormon worldview, which your organization has done a great service to explicate. So I really appreciate that. Now, our friend Newton Lee from the Institute for Education, Research, and Scholarships wonders, with regard to the MTA Conf 2022, is it going to be streamed for those who cannot attend in person?
Yes, it definitely will be streamed. And I would add that through the instrumentality of some generous donors, we've been able to bring in some top tier speakers and so the overall cost of this conference production is quite a bit higher than our previous conferences. And we feel it may have some breakout appeal that will, help us to gain greater notoriety and have a stronger influence within our area especially, but in the world generally. And so I would say if you're thinking about, or if you've ever thought about attending an MTA conference, I would say do make an extra effort to come to this one, because I think it will be a little bit more exciting than usual.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carl, for that. And definitely, I hope that a lot of people will take an interest in the MTA Conf 2022. Decentralized governance possibilities are quite intriguing. And of course, for the Transhumanist Party, that is the future. That is what I hope our party will embrace as well, increasingly, as the technologies that make this possible emerge. Now, we have a very interesting theological question from our friend TJ Wass. He wonders, does the Mormon Transhumanist Association follow the Omega Point theology predicted by Tulane physics professor Frank Tipler, who wrote that everyone will be saved by Jesus Christ and enjoy heaven in the future?
Well, I would say that we certainly share some commonalities with other sort of teleological views of a kind of progress towards some sort of omega point, if you will. One of the first people who described this was Teilhard de Chardin, who was a very interesting Jesuit priest who also made a lot of discoveries in archaeology and the various sciences. But he kind of felt that, he said it first occurred to him as he was actually fighting in the trenches in World War I, and realized the extreme interconnectedness of humanity, in that even in this war, there were factions that were essentially constantly competing with each other, interacting, communicating with each other, and that even in these conflicts, the conflicts were due themselves to our increasing global interconnectedness, and that he felt that that humanity was becoming almost a single organism that would kind of grow ever closer and closer connected until it achieved some kind of state of enlightenment and grace in greater understanding one another. And he referred to this as the omega point. Now, I'm not as familiar with some of the specific views of Frank Tipler on this matter, but I would say that it's really important for me and other Mormon transhumanists to draw a subtle distinction between Jesus and Christ. And what I mean by that is that Jesus was a being whom we revere as the archetype of Christianity, the one who most emulated or who most exemplified the Christian ethic, and that he essentially was Christ, but not the only Christ. And so what I mean by that is that we're all called to take upon ourselves the name of Christ, and we do that in our own faith by entering the waters of baptism. But when one does this, one is essentially making a covenant and commitment to always behave as Christ would were Christ here and on the earth today. And so we also feel that all of the prophets, both small and great, exemplify to some extent or another that Christian ethic and ideal. And so when we say that everyone will be saved by Jesus Christ or in Jesus Christ, I prefer to think of that more as a kind of transfiguration of humanity in this archetype, rather than thinking of it as that we owe allegiance to a single sovereign individual who is kind of lording that authority over us, if you will. So I prefer to think of that as that we're saved in Christ, or saved by becoming Christ, essentially, rather than to think of it as a salvation that consists in kind of a very hierarchical, authoritarian view of heaven. I don't know if that helps at all, but yeah.
Yes, thank you for that answer, Carl. It looks like Jason wants to elaborate on that.
Oh, no, I was just saying I agree with that. I agree with most everything you've been saying, really, so far. I like that you have this concept of God exists on this plane or some of existence that is a magnitude greater than all of That's why when somebody says about playing God, it just it makes me kind of have to try to figure that out, because my whole brain goes from this to, wait a minute, this minus little bitty thing is what you think is God? But that was it.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Maddie.
Yeah, I mean, I share some of your feelings about it, that often the ways that we think of God are very parochial, and maybe not as great as they potentially could be. And one thing I love about many transhumanists is that they I think have very noble aspirations around the type of benevolence that they aspire to, that I would call godly, personally. Now, I guess it's fair to sort of look at times in our past when we've undertaken some grand goal or scheme that has kind of crashed and burned and failed, and realized that humanity, as much as we would like to aspire to these goals, that we don't always make it. We sometimes fall short. And so I think that those who are counseling against hubris and saying, be careful, you're playing God or whatever, may be motivated by that desire to not have a kind of malevolent instantiation of a sort of powerful being, right? Like where it's like a kind of, I think there's the classic story that, the allegory of the Tower of Babel that many Christians turn to and say, well, that's what science and technology is. They're trying to play God, and we saw what happened to them, right? But I prefer to look at that allegory as kind of the danger of pursuing just a purely hedonistic, selfish conception of godliness at the expense of one's fellow beings, right? So what we read, at least from some apocryphal accounts of, like, the city of Sodom and Gomorrah and some other ancient places that were supposedly cursed for their wickedness, is that they were very selfish. That they, there are accounts that says that if someone lost a brick in construction, they would weep, but when a man was killed in construction, they thought nothing of it, right? So this idea that their priorities were kind of out of whack, and they didn't value their fellow beings appropriately. I think of stories of hubris and pride in that vein, is that it's possible for us to pursue something in a selfish way that ultimately causes greater strife and division amongst people, but that it's not bad to pursue a godlike walk, generally speaking. It's just sometimes bad if we do it wrong, I guess.
Yes, very interesting thoughts. Thank you, Carl.
Yeah.
And also, I was fascinated by your discussion of the two strains in American history as originating from the Plymouth settlement in Massachusetts and then the Jamestown settlement in Virginia, and how the more open-ended, open-minded entrepreneurial strain that is also quite prevalent in American thought stems from that Jamestown heritage, so to speak. That is a really insightful historical connection, and I think it draws the distinction very clearly between the kinds of worldviews and the origins of those worldviews that are more open to progress versus those that are attempting to stifle it or put the brakes on it, or focus more on the cautionary aspect against hubris, so to speak. It was interesting also that when I published my illustrated children's book, Death is Wrong, some of the reception from various, let's say, more fundamentalist Christian denominations was, yes, he's correct in stating that death is wrong and death is a terrible predicament for human beings, but he is completely off base in thinking that science and technology can solve the problem of death, and only through faith in Jesus Christ can it be solved. Whereas a religious view that's more open to transhumanism would say that faith in Jesus Christ and science and technology are compatible and complementary, and perhaps it is through science and technology that one is enacting the will of God and trying to overcome suffering, disease, and death. So a practical question is, how can we convince more adherents of various religious views, various denominations of Christianity and other faiths to embrace more of the latter position rather than the former, that pure belief is not enough? You have to act in this world to actually solve these problems.
Well, one piece of advice I have is something that I've started to observe and notice in my own life. And I think one person who was kind of an example for me in this regard was Lincoln Cannon, good friend of mine and co-founder of the association. I noticed that he often was very patient when he would interact with other people online, and would kind of like very patiently expound his views. And if the person responded in a somewhat curt or flippant way, that he often would, give them another chance and try to, turn down the volume just a little bit in the discussion, and really go out of his way to treat the other people he interacted with online charitably, and kind of made an extra effort to build bridges between different communities. And what I've discovered in the course of trying to do this myself is that I've kind of built up a body of responses that I, over the years, have developed only after many painful discussions, if you will. And so what I've discovered is that there are certain techniques and ways of describing these concepts to different groups. And it's often the groups that we have most contact with. So, if you happen to have a certain circle of friends or associates, you might think about, engaging with them in certain ways that, even if, it fails, at least gives you some practice with outreach, and helps you to develop a more compelling way of sharing your ideas in a way that's not threatening, but is intriguing to people. I've found that with Mormon audiences in particular, for better or for worse, they often appreciate some kind of appeal to a church authority, right? So if I quote somebody who is a leader of the church, or who or some scripture from the Bible, or the Book of Mormon, that often can help to persuade people, if I do it in a friendly way and not a kind of dogmatic way. But every group has their things that they see, the things that they value. And if you use the currency that they value, and learn to utilize it in a way that is really effective with them, I think eventually you will be more persuasive. And I'm reminded of the Apostle Paul, who said, basically, I am become all things to all people, that I might by all means gain some or save some. And so he was well known for kind of almost being a chameleon, where he would go into a Greek audience, and given his erudition and his education, he could actually speak their kind of rhetoric and use their kind of terminology. But when he would go to some other audience, he would try to appeal to the things that they valued. And I don't think that he was being too deceptive so much as that he was trying to translate the concepts that he wanted to convey in a way that they'd be most palatable to the audience that he was addressing.
Yes, thank you, Carl. And indeed, Lincoln is quite an effective advocate in these respects. In our YouTube chat, he points out, by an appeal to someone who would be the greatest authority for Christians, that Jesus commands, heal the sick, raise the dead. And he also points out, some religious people will criticize our efforts no matter what we do, but they won't trust a message if it doesn't come from their own authority figures. So an effective communicator, an effective advocate to those audiences would have ample knowledge of what those authority figures said and wrote, and be able to relate that to transhumanist values and aspirations. So the Bible, as he points out, does command Christians to heal the sick and raise the dead. And I think that speaks to the value of having transhumanists of every denomination, because they may be uniquely qualified to reach out to those audiences, to speak their language and dispel misunderstandings. For instance, I'm an atheist. I probably wouldn't be the best person to go before, say, a Southern Baptist Christian congregation and talk to them about transhumanism, because I might be mistaken for the Antichrist or something like that. But a Christian transhumanist would be better suited for that purpose. And that's why we need diversity in our movement as well. Lincoln also has some fascinating comments in the chat, which I think are of great educational value. He writes that Christ is a Greek word that means the same as the Hebrew word Messiah. Both literally refer to a person who is anointed or set apart to a special calling. In Christianity, that special calling is the work to overcome death and suffering, and all Christians covenant to participate in that work. That makes them Christ too. And he clarifies, as invited and exemplified by Jesus. So that's a very interesting view, that Jesus is not the only Christ, that anyone who participates in that work is part of Christ. And that's a very interesting theological point that perhaps not a lot of non-Christians are aware of. Now, on the subject of theodicy, that for me has been one of the significant reasons why I'm an atheist. I see so much, frankly, horror in the world, not just suboptimality, but a lot of phenomena that I don't think any sort of benevolent being would tolerate or approve of. And of course, in common discussions about this with Christians, the point is raised, well, if God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, how can he allow this to happen? And then one goes into all the ways that characterization could be logically contradictory. But you mentioned, Carl, in Mormon theology, God has certain limitations upon him that perhaps prevent him from comprehensively resolving this problem of evil, at least at this time. Could you perhaps elaborate a bit more on what those limitations are, where they come from, and perhaps how transhumanism could fit in eventually overcoming those limitations.
Yeah. So this reminds me of a minister that I heard at some point on, I think, Religion and Ethics News Weekly, which was this PBS program that I really enjoyed watching for a long time and then eventually went off the air, unfortunately. But I remember they interviewed a certain minister, and he said every time people shake their fist at the heavens and say, "How could you let this happen?" God is looking down on them and asking the same question. And what I loved about particular um, that particular way of looking at it was that it sort of recognizes that humanity has been given some type of agency in this whole thing, right? Humanity we're not mere automata, robots kind of going around at the dictation of some divine command. But in fact, we're placed into some kind of a sphere in which we're given the opportunity to truly choose and to suffer the potentially disastrous consequences of those choices, right? That may be because there is no God, looking over us to help us out of this situation. It might also be an orchestrated kind of situation that is for some reason conducive to our progress and benefit. But I find the idea of a constrained God very, it's quite a relief to me, actually, as strange as it sounds. Part of why it's a relief is because, um, we get our hopes up so high. We often get our hopes up about the boss maybe we're like applying for a new job. We're excited about this new boss we're going to work for. Or maybe we get our hopes up with the president-elect, the person that we are putting our vote on, or throughout our lives, there's just a constant stream of disappointments, right? When we place our faith in something that really kind of doesn't fully deliver the way we would like it to. And it wasn't until I developed a kind of stoic acceptance that most people most of the time are going to disappoint me that I sort of started being pleasantly surprised when things turn out better than I thought. Right? If you set your bar really low, then you're just going through life happy all the time because things are turning out a little bit better than the worst possible outcome, right? And so I think in a similar way, and when I look back at my naive view about God and about the type of benevolent, omnipotent God you describe, I realized that I was actually projecting that same view of God on many authority figures in my life, and I was becoming almost bitter, and angry and frustrated, and I would add really briefly that as we're talking about ways of outreach and ways of being a better representative of transhumanism, I just want to recognize that many people here are experiencing some kind of trauma from their upbringing. They maybe had a very difficult religious upbringing, like the person who commented earlier, and so they maybe have very good reasons for losing faith in the sort of naive conceptions of authority and God that have been presented to them. But as I think more about a constrained God, what I realize is that I can relate to that kind of God better because I feel that I'm constantly surrounded by things I would like to do better than I can, situations that I would like to be better than they are. And I imagine, what if this is all there is? Worlds without end throughout all time and eternity. What if, as Rilke said, we're just constantly being defeated by stronger and stronger enemies, right? At every stage of our progression, we may just be increasing in our capacity, but always somewhat frustrated that we can't do as much as we would like to have done. And I personally feel that kind of a conception of God, even if they're way beyond me, is much more relatable to me and is something I feel I can emulate better than one that is utterly superlative, right? I also just want to briefly touch on the fact that the Mormon conception of God, even though we sometimes use the word, the pronoun he to refer to God, we really do think of God as both having a male and female character. So sometimes we use the term heavenly parents. And sometimes we even refer to like the entire divine community of heaven as God. And so God may even be better thought of as a full community. And so when I imagine the vastness of the cosmos and all the different galaxies and worlds out there, I imagine that it would be very unlikely that we would be the most advanced or the only civilization ever to have emerged in the universe. And therefore, there is very probably a group of beings out there, or many communities of such beings, who would have attained such a degree of benevolence that I would be strongly tempted to worship them, and who, for my intents and purposes, I could conceive of as God. Now, I don't know exactly where and how they exist, but I do think that this opens up the theological possibilities so much when we can start to conceive of God in a relative degree of perfection rather than a superlative or absolute degree.
Yes, thank you. That is an immensely insightful answer, and we will explore it a bit more shortly. First of all, I would like to thank Celeste Castaldo for her generous contribution, and the image in the chat says, "Thanks for being you." I think that applies to everyone in this conversation. We really appreciate your unique perspectives, your backgrounds, and what those bring to transhumanism as a diverse and flourishing movement. And then our friend Mike Lazine writes that on the subject of theodicy and the problem of evil, a number of faiths say that God will step in with his judgment day, and that still hasn't happened. In my view, that seems to kind of put off the problem, so to speak. We have urgent suboptimalities that need resolving, including disease and death and cruelty and various kinds of material privations that humans suffer through. So I indeed would prefer a different answer than, oh, Judgment Day will happen and all of these problems will go away. Jason, you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, the whole thing about Judgment Day and all that. A lot of people seem to have some misinterpretations of, and it's not the first time. If you go back during the time of Jesus, they didn't really get it either. They thought that he was there that the prophecy meant he's supposed to save them from the Romans, when that's not what was going on. I think it's the same kind of thing that's going on today, where they're assuming one thing's going to happen, but that's not really how, it's going to, work out. So it's going to be interesting. It'd be nice. This isn't my idea, but good friend I respect, it would be nice if we could get together some, like you and Micah and all of us, and alongside the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, put down some sort of, transhumanist doctrine and make an effort to, on paper, reconcile transhumanism and religion, because I believe it can be done. And I think we're doing it, and you're doing awesome at it. So,
yeah, I would say that I definitely think that a transhumanist Bill of Rights should include the notion that people of all, races, creeds, ethnicities, various kind of perspectives that they can embrace transhumanism. That it's not necessary to belong to a certain denomination or group of any kind in order to do so, and that we should try to articulate our values in a way that they can be as universal as possible, while without compromising some of the essential goals. And I think of this kind of like the just the Geneva Convention and the some of the International Bill of Human Rights that were developed in different treaties that we think of, and how they're trying to identify sort of traits or privileges that should be common to everybody. I think we could articulate our values, if we haven't already done so, in a way that embraces both people of faith and people of no faith, right?
Indeed, we do have that kind of statement in Article 1 of the Transhumanist Bill of Rights. This is the relevant excerpt. All sentient entities are hereby entitled to pursue any and all rights within this document to the degree they deem desirable, including not at all. All sentient entities are entitled to the extent of their individual decisions to all the rights and freedoms set forth in the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, without distinction of any kind, such as race, sex, color, gender, language, religion, political, or other opinion. And it goes on along those lines. So we very much try to be as universalist as possible, as encompassing of people from a variety of backgrounds and perspectives, because really transhumanism is about attempting to unite the human species in these shared aims. I think
if we're going to live forever, we better just start learning how to get along now, because it's going to be a while.
Absolutely.
Here. I think one other interesting thing about transhumanism in regards to these, like when I see these bills of rights that are often shared, they have usually a list of categories, right? Race, color, sex, gender, language. We as transhumanists could add a few categories to that list that many others don't typically think of, right? So we could add biology and anatomy to those things, because we even imagine a day when we may be in contact with other species that attain a degree of intelligence that allows us to communicate with them, either uplifted organisms here on Earth, or perhaps artificial intelligences, as well as possibly even alien species of some kind. So I think that because of how far we're thinking into the future, transhumanists tend to imagine ways that the rights of personhood could extend far further than most people typically think of, and even ways that conflict could emerge when society does not properly recognize those rights, right?
Yes, indeed. And actually, in Article 1 of the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, the continuation is exactly along the lines that you were speaking to, Carl. So in the list, after gender, language, religion, political, or other opinion, national, social, or planetary origin, we have property, birth, including manner of birth, biological or non-biological origins, or other status. So that is open-ended, and hopefully the other status component of this could encompass perhaps additional distinctions among sentient entities that might arise in the future, and we would include entities on all sides of those distinctions. So definitely a great conversation about the expansion of our notions of who are entities deserving of rights that as science and technology advance, we need to take into account. And along those lines, our friend Newton Lee from the Institute for Education, Research, and Scholarships points out transhumanism, like any other ism, can mean different things to different people. Take computer science, for example. No one in the world objects to the use of computers, but some people have negative views on artificial intelligence, which is a big part of computer science. That's why we need to educate the public by demystifying transhumanism and AI. And we've spoken about sentient rights as well. Do you think, Carl, there's a possibility that at some point we will have artificial general intelligence that is also self-aware in some respect and would be then deserving of rights and citizenship and participation in our communities on similar terms as humans?
I do. And I think this part of my view on this kind of derives from my view that all the phenomena that we're experiencing derive from some form of materialism, that even so-called spiritual phenomena, even the sublime, love and tenderness that we can experience from one person to another, it ultimately derives from the nature of our physical existence. And so I don't think that undermines or trivializes it in any way. But because I feel that our anatomy ultimately is what makes us capable of doing what we're doing, I think that one way or another, by either reverse engineering what is happening in humans or by trying to approximate what's happening through just first principles, that sooner or later it will be possible to achieve artificial general intelligence. And I really look forward to these times as kind of an amazing opportunity to learn more about ourselves and to hopefully tenderly, bring up these other intelligences and treat them as best as we can. Like, one of the things I fear sometimes is the idea that because we don't fully understand the nature of intelligence, we might unwittingly subject emerging AIs to some sort of horrible torture while they're getting to the point where we really realize that they deserve rights of their own, right? So, but I do believe in that. Now, all that said, I have to admit that I have heard some accounts from both, people who are traditionally religious and others that give me pause of some kind of clairvoyance or ability of people occasionally on some occasions to do strange things that are not fully easily explained by everyday science. I'm reminded, for example, of this book I read that was quite popular in the 70s called The Road Less Traveled by a psychologist named Scott Peck. And he talks about this time when he and his wife went to some foreign country, and it was their first time after touching down on the plane. It was evening, and they were strolling along some sort of promenade, and they saw a building in the distance, and they said, "I wonder what that is." And for some reason, without skipping a beat, he said, "That is the Jakarta Cricket Club." And he didn't even know where that came from or what benefit it had to him to say such a thing or to know such a thing. It seemed like a very trivial fact that had no impact on his life in any way. But when they went to the building later on in the daylight, they saw that, in fact, he was exactly right. And that, there was nothing he knew prior to that would have indicated that he had this awareness. And so, it's weird because when I've read occasional stories like this, I'm like, where did that come from? And what benefit would any divine being have in revealing such trivial information to somebody? I don't even know where to place those kinds of experiences other than to say that sometimes weird things seem to happen and I can't fully explain them. And it may be that these are all completely explainable physical properties of our cosmos that don't actually prove the existence of any kind of supreme being in any way, but they're just latent characteristics of humanity that haven't fully been explored or understood yet, right? But I just want to say that I leave the door open to some strange occasional things that I can't fully explain right now, if that makes sense.
Very interesting remarks. Thank you, Carl. And Lincoln Cannon weighs in. He writes, will we create artificial general intelligence? Yes, we are proof of concept. We are God's artificial general intelligence. And he also writes, will we become complicit in the problem of evil when creating AGIs? And he points out already, to the extent that we procreate biological children, we are already complicit. So very interesting observations there. Now, I also want to open the floor up to Art Ramon Garcia for any questions or comments that he might have.
Yeah, along the concepts of transfiguration, a lot of Mormons contact me and I send them your website, but they don't respond. So I think they're still under the belief that, the transfiguration is going to be spiritual, metaphysical, fifth dimensional evolution, where we'll be angel-like beings in the light of God. But now, like your organization, you're familiar with science, and you can see where science is going, and how merging with AI and brain implants and creating a hive mind, a global hive mind, will create new realities. And then possibly those new realities will, like I said, connect with other beings in sort of a cosmic internet. And we will be this hive mind that will have the capability to look into other realities. And by being able to look into these other realities, it will transform our perception of our reality. So, the global hive mind metaverse connected with the gods that exist out there. So, it's very interesting. I think your organization is going in that direction. But like I said, these Mormons who contact me, they completely ignore your website when I send it to them.
That's interesting. It's funny. We have kind of a varied reception amongst our fellow Mormons. Like, there are times when someone's like, wow, I hadn't ever thought of it that way. That's really fascinating. And there are other times when they're saying, like, you guys are doing it completely wrong, and when, there are some members of the church who, and this is really quite fascinating, actually. It's like, as I said earlier, Mormons are generally very receptive to new technology, but it's almost like the particular promises and tenets of the faith itself and the kinds of principles that are often taught in Sunday school, so to speak, are often compartmentalized in a way where they don't think of them as, infiltrating into our daily lives quite as much as maybe they should. And so they're like, oh, well, when God comes to do these things, of course, it's not going to be a scientific or technological process. It's just going to be, we're just going to be zapped in some sort of magic Harry Potter-like way. I don't know, whatever it is that they're imagining there. And yet I think that when you are confronted with the amazing and astounding advances of humanity in the recent history, like we are, and you start to see how much humanity is achieving, I think it definitely gave us pause as we were, contemplating the founding of the association and what we could do to contribute in the world. We were just thinking, we were really struck by how a lot of things that we might have thought about in a naive way might be better explained with the things that are emerging around us right now. But there's a lot of people who have these preconceptions, and they just haven't really considered that. And sometimes I think the idea that God might be actually closer than this faraway being who will eventually come down and fix everything is somewhat threatening, even, that maybe the means that God is using are just kind of more advanced versions of the tools that we already have at our disposal, right? So I think that when these two typically non-overlapping magisteria start to kind of like infiltrate one another's territory, it becomes a lot more disturbing, and there are folks who can't deal with the cognitive dissonance, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And our friend Mike Lazine states that that is the thinking of the faith that he left, where the practitioners of that faith believe in supernatural miracles for God making mankind perfect and immortal, but perhaps they disdain the more practical means for human self-improvement. And I was intrigued by the comments you made about the potential for other intelligent life forms to exist. And if they are much more advanced than we are, we may indeed relate to them as if they were gods. I think the ancient Greek gods, for instance, were very similar to those kinds of beings in terms of how they were portrayed, essentially superhumans, more akin to what we would think of as superheroes with particular powers, but humans could still defy them, act autonomously, sometimes even outsmart them. So that is definitely a more relatable vision. I have also been thinking about how would one of us be received in an earlier epoch if we were transported all of a sudden to ancient Greece or even Judea during the first century CE, and we had a little microcosm of our contemporary technologies around us. We had some sort of hidden base where we had computers, the internet, we had all of our material goods, all of our tools, we had perhaps advanced weaponry in case we needed to defend ourselves. And we went forth into the world kind of confident that this technology would protect us if we needed it to protect us, but also being a bit subtle, kind of representing some of the workings of that technology as miraculous. As Arthur C. Clarke pointed out in his Third Law, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So to people in earlier eras of history, would we be seen as gods or perhaps demigods, given our still evident limitations, but also our amazing capabilities?
You know, it's funny that I've often conducted similar thought experiments, and I don't know why I like to do this stuff. There was a great Reddit thread once that almost got syndicated into some kind of a TV program or something called Rome Sweet Rome, where somebody imagine what it would be like to take a modern military unit and zap them back into ancient Rome and see how they dealt with, their complete lack of connectivity with the modern world, but they're still having tools and vehicles and other things that could work for a while. And, what kind of conflicts that would create. I think those are fun thought experiments. And I think in some ways it would be a rather dangerous venture, because I think that any knowledge you had would be so advantageous to whomever could persuade you to ally with them that you would be you would be seen as a huge threat to just about anyone who encountered you, and they would either want you to be on their side or they would want you dead. So I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking too competitively here, but it's fascinating to think about stuff like that.
Yes, well, given the attitudes common in those eras, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the empires and militaries of the world at that time would indeed see us or our contemporary counterparts as immense threats if they were to arrive in those earlier eras with our modern technology. Lincoln Cannon points out that I would be crucified for transhumanism in ancient Greece, and our friend Mike Lazine thinks all of this would make for a great TV show. Indeed, I would watch that. It would be quite intriguing from a philosophical perspective. Now, there are some Star Trek episodes where the crew of the Enterprise does go down, and despite the Prime Directive, ends up somewhat influencing the affairs of less advanced cultures. So we have those kinds of ideas to explore there. And I think Lincoln Cannon points out that the Greek democracy, the Athenian democracy, executed Socrates, and this was in part because of allegations of atheism on Socrates' part. So Socrates was definitely far more advanced than his contemporaries intellectually, and unfortunately his contemporaries did not appreciate that. I'd like to thank David Shoemaker for his generous donation. He writes that this has been an insightful and excellent discussion, and he thanks you, Carl, for your words today. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Jason Geringer for his remarks.
Yeah, I just want to make a point about the AI, and I think this is another place where a lot of people are sort of have a little misinterpretation of how it might be like. They tend to have this dark view, like AI is going to take our brain over, or you know, we're going to give away our free will to the AI when we merge and all of this. But I don't believe it's going to be like that. The things that the AI takes from the human, or we give to the AI, is going to be the parts that we want to give to the AI. We want the AI to have empathy and emotions, you know. So it's not this dark thing. It's better, you know. So that, you know, that being said, I did Mormonism start with? I heard the story of a Moroni, and I was wondering what you, is that the correct name? And
yeah. So Joseph Smith, Joseph Smith recorded accounts of what he called kind of divine manifestations or visions. And one of the first ones was of a angelic being whom he called Moroni, that showed him what in vision, what the location of some kind of ancient record that later became his translation of the Book of Mormon. Now, there are varying views amongst Mormons as to the degree to which the Book of Mormon is a historical record or not, and there's a lot of, it's a hotly contested and debated question. I personally find many anachronisms in the Book of Mormon that make it, at least to some degree, a product of Joseph Smith's environment. But it may also contain inspiration in ancient words of wisdom, and there are varying views amongst Mormons on that. I'd say one challenge that our community currently is experiencing is like how to deal with this potential reinterpretation of literal narratives into perhaps something more metaphorical or figurative, or something that someone might still deem to be scripture but might not be historical. And that continues to be a bit of a challenge for our community, because we're a relatively young faith tradition that's only had about 200 years. And when Joseph Smith taught these things, and I believe he personally, sincerely felt like he was experiencing these things himself, but was a very, as I said, he was very audacious and willing to speculate about things in ways that he was convinced were the case, that may or may not have been. But they were very plausible things for many people in his day. And yet, as we get more and more removed from the cultural context in which those claims emerge, it becomes more difficult to make them relevant to our day-to-day concerns here. And so one of the challenges I think that all faith communities have is this idea of how do we reinterpret our narratives in a way that continues to be valuable to us, but that is still believable, plausible, acceptable, still fits with the truths that we have learned since that founding experience, right? I think that is in keeping with the spirit of Mormonism, which is that we should be embracing truth no matter where we find it. So as we embrace truths that complicate our origin narratives, I think that's one of the challenges that we're experiencing right now, is like how embrace those different views amongst members of the church, and how to what degree of literalism you need to kind of adhere to be a good Mormon, so to speak.
I found it very interesting that what I heard was that it was made of gold. And it got me to thinking, if I was going to, or someone was to leave some information behind, you would want it. I mean, gold it doesn't corrode. It's going to be there. You can't just put it on iron or anything else. It'll be rusted away. So it got me to wondering, wow, man, I wonder if there's like some stuff like that made out of crystal. Because back then they didn't have computers or nothing. You know what I mean? I wonder if there's another one made out of crystal somewhere.
So one really interesting,
might give to you.
I was going to say, one really interesting observation that you share, Jason, that kind of this all reminds me of. By the way, how do I paste something into the comment section? I don't see an open. Do I have to log in or something to be able to do that? Or
there's a private chat window
so I can
in
paste
the
it there.
StreamYard interface.
So it's interesting that you talk about, recording things in metal as a kind of effective way of preserving information for long generations into the future, right? And ironically, there's this technology called MDisk that I just shared in the private chat that was invented by Mormons. And what it is it's actually, you can buy CD and DVD burners now that support MDisk technology. I have one of these burners, but instead of burning into an optical format that eventually loses its kind of state over a matter of just like a few years or decades, the MDisk technology is actually supposedly imprinted onto some kind of metal layer, and they say that it has archival properties that would last for at least 1,000 years and possibly more. So I find it really interesting. I think part of what may have inspired these Mormon inventors to build this system was our stories about the Book of Mormon being recorded on gold plates. So in strange ways, they talk about art changing reality, right? It's just interesting to see how sometimes the figment of an idea can kind of become realized and become concrete in the real world, right?
Yes, that is quite fascinating. And it's fascinating that the MDisk was inspired by these kinds of religious traditions within Mormonism as well. So Celeste Castaldo would like to expand upon the discussion of transfigurism and the term transfiguration. So I was able to locate this dictionary definition of transfiguration as a complete change of form or appearance into a more beautiful or spiritual state. And Celeste wonders, what is the Mormon transhumanist view of transfiguration? What are the predictions of that view? And could you perhaps expand upon the term transfigurism and its meaning for those who might not be as familiar with it?
Yeah, so transfigurism is a term that we originally, I think Lincoln was one of the first people to kind of come up with the word, and we registered the domain name, but we didn't strongly. I think in the course of like determining what the name of our organization would be, we didn't end up with anything that had transfigurism in the title, perhaps because we felt that it wasn't sufficiently understood, or it was kind of a new term that had been coined by one of us, and we weren't sure if it would convey everything right off the bat. So, but for historical reasons, the domain name stuck, and that's kind of the main place where you see this term, right? It's not mentioned too frequently, but I would say that in general, I view transfigurism as this kind of orientation towards an eventual transfiguration of humanity, right? So transfigurism would be a way of thinking about the singularity or the advancement of humanity in almost religious terms, thinking of it as a profoundly sublime experience beyond just some kind of technological achievement, right? So what's fascinating to me about all both transhumanism and the ways that we've associated with our theology is how similar these views start to become as you're talking about some of the hoped for futures of humanity. You know, when transhumanists talk about the singularity or some kind of future state of bliss that humans will be able to achieve through their technological achievements, they talk about it not just in terms of capabilities, but also in terms of like virtue, right? They talk about the ability to develop greater compassion and greater wisdom and greater insight than we could have before. And when we think about transfiguration, we also think about it in an aesthetic way, more than just living forever and not being subject to disease and death. But we think of it as almost like an amazingly spiritual, uplifting experience. And so in our scriptures, there is a day of transfiguration that's spoken of in the future sometime, where humans will be transformed into some kind of a state that will cause them no longer to experience death, and to it even says that, you know, they may attain a certain age, but then be transformed from mortality into immortality in the twinkling of an eye. So this notion of a future date where we would be transfigured to be closer to the image of God is kind of a prophesied event in Mormon scripture. And we're kind of just exploring the possibility that future transfiguration is achieved at least partly through science and technology.
Yes, indeed. I can see a lot of parallels between the concept of transfiguration and longevity escape velocity, when even though the idea of longevity escape velocity is not that we become immortal or indestructible right away, but we reach a state where we can hope that medical technology can rejuvenate us faster than the rate of biological aging and the accumulation of damage. So that would be a qualitatively different condition, in that we would look at the world very differently. We would lead our lives very differently if we can expect open-ended lifespans. So thank you very much, Carl, for those remarks. We have 2 minutes left in our broadcast. What final comments would you like to make to our viewers today?
I would just like to thank you for the time that I've been able to share with you some of our thinking, some of our origin story, and also to commend you for the work that you're doing to try to increase awareness of many of the concerns that we share. And back to the question that was asked about how we can persuade more people to start thinking about these things and to be receptive to these things, I just would say, you know, it might sound strange, but keep the faith, in the sense that I want you guys to keep doing all the efforts that you're doing to really try to, in a friendly way, engage with people of different backgrounds and different viewpoints. If it's too difficult with some cantankerous individuals, then just move on to somebody else who might be a little bit more receptive, and, you know, dust yourself off and keep going. And you know, I know that it can be challenging. I want to honor the struggle and the story of each one of you, because I know that each of us has different backgrounds, and we've even talked with some folks here who've had a very traumatic experience with religion in their formative years. And so I don't really bear any grudge or judgment towards those who've come to different conclusions than I have, partly because of their life experiences. But I do feel that there's a lot that we can learn from one another, and I hope we continue to do so. And I want to just thank you again, and I'll share those thoughts with you all.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you very much, Carl, for those words of encouragement and support and acceptance. They mean a lot to me and to all of our guests and attendees. And thank you to our viewers. Thank you to our panel. Our producer, Bill, just mentioned that we are in the top 5 programs on talkstreamlive.com right now. So congratulations on that achievement for our Virtual Enlightenment Salon. And until next time, every Sunday at 1 p.m. U.S. Pacific Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, live long and prosper.